The night my parents threw me out of the house, my mother said something that should have broken me. Instead, it turned out to be the beginning of the biggest mistake they would ever make. "You're not our son anymore, Adrian," she said coldly, pointing toward the front door like she was dismissing a stranger. "Take your things and leave. My name is Adrian Keller, and until that moment I believed family meant loyalty. I believed blood meant something. But as I stood there in the living room holding a small backpack, watching my parents stare at me like I had ruined their lives, I realized something far more painful to them. I had never really belonged. My father, Victor Keller, stood beside the fireplace with his arms crossed. His expensive watch glimmered under the chandelier light, a reminder that everything in this house revolved around success, status, and appearances. And according to them, I had failed all three. "You embarrassed this family," he said sharply. "Your brother built a real career. What did you do? Waste years on some computer project?" Across the room, my older brother Dylan Keller leaned casually against the wall, a faint smile playing on his lips. Dylan had always been the golden child, straight A's. Prestigious job. Perfect reputation. Everything I wasn't. "You should have listened to Dad years ago," Dylan said with a shrug. "But no, you wanted to be a founder." The word came out like an insult. I didn't respond. Anything to say but, because arguing with them had never changed anything before. 3 years earlier, I had left a comfortable corporate job to build something from scratch. A cybersecurity platform designed to protect companies from data breaches. I worked from a tiny apartment, survived on instant noodles, and spent countless nights debugging code while everyone else slept. To my family, it looked like failure too. Me, it was the future. But they never asked what I was actually building. They only saw what they wanted to see. "Are you done?" my mother asked impatiently. I zipped my backpack slowly. "Yeah," said quietly. She walked to the door and opened it. Cold night air rushed into the house. "Good," she said. "Then leave." For a moment, I looked around the living room. The house I had grown up in, same place where birthday parties had once filled the air with laughter, where my parents used to cheer when I brought home school trophies, it felt strange realizing those memories no longer meant anything to them. I stepped toward the door. Behind me, Dylan laughed softly. "Don't worry," he said. "Maybe your little startup will buy you a cardboard box someday." My father chuckled. I paused at the doorway. Not because I was hurt, but because something about the moment felt strangely calm, like the end of one story and the beginning of another. I turned slightly and looked at them one last time. "You know what the funny part is?" I said. My father frowned. "What?" I adjusted the strap of my backpack. "You still think I failed?" Dylan rolled his eyes. "Because you did." I almost smiled. "Sure," I said quietly. Then I stepped outside. The door slammed shut behind me. For a few seconds, I just stood on the sidewalk under the dim streetlight. The cold wind brushed past me, carrying the distant sound of traffic. From the main road, most people would have felt destroyed in that moment, thrown out of their own home, rejected by their own family. But the truth was, I had been preparing for this day longer than they realized, because 3 weeks earlier, something had happened that none of them knew about. Something that was about to change everything. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked. At the screen, a message from Detective Laura Bennett. The text was short. "Everything is ready. Just say the word." I stared at the message for a moment. Then I looked back at the house. Through the living room window, I could see my father pouring himself a drink while Dylan laughed about something. They looked completely relaxed, completely confident, completely. Unaware, I typed a single reply. "Do it." Across the street, an unmarked black sedan slowly turned the corner. Inside the house, my parents had no idea what was about to happen. But in less than 10 minutes, someone would knock on their door. And this time, it wouldn't be family. It would be the police. Asterisk, asterisk inside the Keller house. The mood had already shifted back to normal the moment the door slammed behind me to them. The problem had been removed. My father, Victor Keller, poured a glass of expensive whiskey and leaned back in his leather chair like he had just finished handling an annoying business matter. My mother, Elaine Keller, walked back toward the dining table, adjusting the sleeves of her designer sweater as if throwing her own son. Out of the house had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Well," she said calmly, "that's finally over." My brother Dylan laughed as he picked up his phone. "I give him 2 weeks before he comes crawling back," he said. "Maybe less." Victor took a slow sip of whiskey. "He won't," he replied confidently. "Adrian is too stubborn for that." Elaine sighed with visible relief. "Good. Because I'm done pretending that boy was ever going to make something of himself." None of them noticed the black sedan quietly parking across the street. None of them noticed the second vehicle pulling up behind it. And none of them noticed the 2 uniformed officers stepping out under the streetlights inside the house. Dylan was still scrolling through his phone. "You know what the funniest part is?" he said suddenly. "Adrian actually thought his stupid cybersecurity thing would turn into a company." Victor chuckled. "Every failed entrepreneur thinks that." Elaine shook her head. "He should have listened to his father and taken a normal job." Dylan leaned back in his chair. "I mean, seriously? Cybersecurity? Who does he think he is? Some Silicon Valley genius?" Victor smirked. "If he had any real talent, investors would have noticed." Dylan nodded. "Exactly." Outside to police. Officers walked up the Keller driveway. A third man stepped out of the unmarked sedan behind them. He wore a dark coat and carried a thin black folder under his arm. The porch lights illuminated their shadows as they approached the front door. Inside the house, the conversation continued. "Honestly," Dylan said, "this might actually be good for him. Maybe getting kicked out will finally force him to grow up." Victor placed his glass down on the table. "I doubt it." Elaine crossed her arms. "Either way, he's not our responsibility anymore." Then knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed sharply through the house. Dylan frowned. "Who the hell is that?" Victor glanced at the clock on the wall. "Almost midnight," he muttered. Elaine walked toward the door. "Probably a delivery driver." At the wrong house, she opened it and froze. Standing on the porch were 2 police officers. Behind them stood the man from the sedan watching quietly. Elaine blinked in confusion. "Yes." One of the officers stepped forward. "Good evening." "Ma'am, is this the residence of Victor Keller?" Elaine nodded slowly. "Yes." "Why?" Victor stood up from the living room. "That's me," he called out. He walked toward the door with the calm confidence of someone who had never once expected the police to show up at his home. "What seems to be the problem?" officers asked. The second officer pulled a document from a folder. "We're here regarding an active investigation." Victor frowned. "Investigation?" Dylan had already walked into the hallway, curious. "What investigation?" The officer's tone remained calm and professional. "It concerns a cybersecurity breach involving financial institutions across 3 states. Victor's expression shifted slightly. "And what does that have to do with me?" The man in the dark coat finally stepped forward. He opened the folder in his hand. "Quite a lot, actually." Victor stared at him. "And you are?" The man held up a badge. "Detective Laura Bennett, Cybercrime Division." The hallway suddenly felt very quiet. Elaine glanced nervously between them. There must be some mistake. Detective Bennett didn't look convinced. "Mr. Keller," she said calmly, "we have reason to believe that data servers connected to your business network were used to facilitate a large-scale breach." Victor scoffed. "That's ridiculous." Laughed. "Yeah, you've got the wrong house." Detective Bennett flipped open the folder. "I wish that were true." She slid a photograph out and held it up. Victor's confident expression disappeared because the image showed something he recognized immediately. A server rack inside his own office, and stamped across the evidence photo was the company name Keller Financial Holdings. Victor's voice lowered. "Where did you get that?" Detective Bennett closed the folder slowly. "From someone who knows your system better than you do." Across the street, I watched the entire scene unfold from inside the parked sedan, and as the police stepped into the house, my parents had just thrown me out of. I realized something ironic. For the first time in years, they were finally going to learn exactly what I had been working on. Inside the Keller house, the confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier vanished almost instantly. Victor. Keller stared at the photograph Detective Bennett was holding, as if the image itself had betrayed him. The server rack in the picture was unmistakable. It was installed in the secured room behind his office, a place only a few employees even knew existed. "That's impossible," Victor said quietly. Detective Laura Bennett didn't react to his tone. She simply held the photo. "Steady. Is this your equipment, Mr. Keller?" Victor hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. "But that doesn't prove anything." Dylan crossed his arms, stepping forward like he was about to defend the family name. "My father runs a financial company," he said sharply. "Of course we have servers. That doesn't mean we hacked anything." Elaine nodded quickly. "There must be some misunderstanding." Detective Bennett finally lowered the photo and opened the folder again. "We've been tracking a network intrusion that targeted several banking systems," she explained calmly. "The attackers routed their traffic through a chain of private servers designed to hide the origin point." Victor frowned. "So," she turned another page, "the last node in that chain leads directly here."
Silence filled the hallway.
Dylan let out a short laugh. "You're saying hackers used our servers? That sounds like a problem for your department, not ours." One of the uniformed officers spoke for the first time. "That's exactly what we thought at first." Victor looked irritated now. "Then why are you here?" Detective Bennett closed the folder halfway and looked directly at him. "Because someone inside this house had full administrative control over those servers." Victor shook his head immediately. "That's ridiculous." "Only our IT contractor manages that system," Dylan added quickly. "Yeah, and he's been working with us for years." Detective Bennett raised an eyebrow. "And what's his name?" Victor hesitated. "Mark something," he said. "Mark Ellison, I think." Bennett wrote the name down without emotion. "Interesting." Elaine looked confused. "Why?" The detective slid another paper from the folder and handed it to Victor. It was a document showing login activity. From the company's private servers, Victor scanned it quickly. His face slowly turned pale. "What is this?" Dylan asked impatiently. Victor swallowed. "These are admin access logs." Dylan leaned closer. "So," Victor pointed at a specific line on the page. "Look at the timestamps." Dylan frowned as he read them. Every entry was from the last 2 months, but what caught his attention wasn't the timing. It was the username attached to every login. Dylan's voice dropped. "Adrian." Elaine blinked. "What?" Victor flipped the page over like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "That's not possible," he said under his breath. Detective Bennett spoke again. "According to these records, Adrian Keller had administrator-level access to the entire server network." Elaine looked stunned. "That's ridiculous. Adrian doesn't even work for the company."
Oh.
Victor looked uneasy now. "He helped us set up the security framework years ago," he admitted. Dylan stared at him. "You never told me that?" Victor looked annoyed because it wasn't important. Detective Bennett tilted her head slightly. Apparently, it was very important. Victor slammed the papers back into the folder. "Listen, my son is many things," he said firmly. "But he's not some criminal mastermind." Glenn nodded. "He can barely run his own life." The detective studied their faces for a moment. Then she asked one simple question. "Where is Adrian Keller right now?" Elaine crossed her arms. "He doesn't live here anymore." Detective Bennett's expression didn't change. "Since when?" Elaine hesitated. "About 15 minutes ago." One of the officers exchanged a glance with the detective. Victor suddenly looked irritated. "What does Adrian have to do with any of this?" Detective Bennett slowly closed the folder. "Well," she said calmly, "for starters." She pulled out one final sheet of paper, a printed message log. Victor's eyes narrowed as he read. The top line. It was a text message sent just minutes earlier. "Everything is ready. Just say the word." Victor looked up sharply. "Where did you get this?" Detective Bennett's voice stayed calm. From Adrian Keller. The room went completely silent. Elaine whispered, "What does that mean?" The detective slid the message log back into the folder. "It means,"
Nice.
she said quietly, "your son contacted us 3 weeks ago." Victor felt his stomach tighten. Why? Detective Bennett looked him directly in the eyes. Because Adrian Keller isn't the suspect. She paused. He's the lead cybersecurity consultant assisting our investigation. Dylan blinked in disbelief. What? And at that exact moment, another police car pulled into the driveway. Asterisk, asterisk, the sound of another police car pulling into. The driveway shattered the fragile silence inside the Keller house. Through the open front door, the flashing red and blue lights painted the walls in restless colors. For the first time that night, Victor Keller no longer looked like the confident businessman who controlled every room he entered. He looked uncertain. Dylan was the first to speak. "This is insane," he said, shaking his head. "Adrian, helping. The police." Detective Laura Bennett didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped slightly aside as 2 more officers approached the door carrying sealed evidence cases. Victor's voice hardened again. "What exactly is going on here?" Bennett met his eyes calmly. "We're executing a warrant to examine your company's internal servers." Lane's face turned pale. "You can't just walk into our home like this." One of the officers held up the document. "Ma'am, we already have." Victor grabbed the warrant and scanned it quickly. The official seal of the cybercrime division sat at the bottom of the page. His hands tightened. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. Dylan turned toward the detective. "Let me get this straight," he said. "You're telling us Adrian, the same Adrian who couldn't even keep a real job, is suddenly some cybersecurity expert working with the police?" Detective Bennett didn't flinch. "That's correct," Victor scoffed. "He built a hobby project in his apartment." Bennett tilted her head slightly. "You mean CentraShield?" Victor froze. Dylan frowned. "What?" The detective opened the folder again. CentraShield is a cybersecurity monitoring system designed to detect advanced network intrusions in real time. Dylan looked confused. "What does that have to do with Adrian?" Bennett answered without hesitation. "He built it." Elaine shook her head. "No, he didn't." The detective slid a printed article from the folder. Victor looked down. At the top of the page was a headline from a major tech publication. "New AI cyber defense system helps authorities trace financial breach network." Below the headline was a photograph of Adrian Keller. Victor's throat tightened. "This is fake." Bennett folded the article calmly. "It's not." Dylan grabbed the paper and read it quickly. His confident expression faded with every line. "This says, CentraShield helped trace the hacking network across multiple corporate servers." He looked up slowly, "including ours." Victor stared at the detective. "Are you telling me my son built the system you're using to investigate this case?" "Yes," Elaine whispered. "That's impossible." But Bennett continued. 3 weeks ago, Adrian Keller contacted our department after noticing suspicious activity in a server network connected to your company. Victor's voice lowered dangerously. "You're accusing me of hacking banks now?" "No," Bennett replied. "We're investigating who used your infrastructure to do it." Dylan looked confused again, but Adrian had access to those servers. Bennett nodded. Double quotes. "Yes," which is exactly how he discovered the intrusion. Victor suddenly understood something that made his chest tighten. "He was monitoring our network." "Yes." Dylan shook his head. "Why would he do that?" The detective's answer was simple. Because your company's security system was full of vulnerabilities. Victor's pride took the hit like a punch. "That's absurd." Bennett slid another document onto the table. "This report says otherwise." Victor skimmed the pages quickly. The analysis was detailed, precise, every weakness in his company's digital infrastructure had been mapped. Every flaw explained, and every page carried the same author name. Adrian Keller. Victor's voice dropped. "He never showed me this." Bennett's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did you ever ask?" Victor didn't answer. Dylan stared at the report like it had personally insulted him. So Adrian suddenly becomes some genius hacker hunter and calls the police. Bennett corrected him calmly. He didn't call us because he wanted attention. Paused. He called us because he believed someone inside your company might be involved. Elaine gasped. That's ridiculous. Victor's jaw tightened. Are you suggesting one of my employees is behind this? Bennett looked at him carefully. That's one possibility. Dylan laughed nervously. This whole thing is insane. But the detective wasn't finished. However, she continued. There is another reason Adrian contacted us. Victor frowned. What reason? Bennett's voice remained calm because he believed someone was trying to frame him. The words hung in the air. Victor blinked. Frame him? Bennett nodded. Double quotes, yes. Dylan frowned. That doesn't make any sense. The detective slowly opened the folder again. There's one more detail you should know. Victor felt an uncomfortable tension rising in his chest. What? Bennett placed a photograph on the table. Victor looked down, and his stomach dropped because the image showed something he recognized instantly. A laptop screen with Adrian's cybersecurity system open, and the user logged into the admin panel. This wasn't Adrian, it was Adrian Keller. For a moment, nobody in the Keller house moved. The photograph lay on the table between them like a silent accusation. Victor Keller stared at it, as if his eyes might somehow change what it showed. The laptop screen was crystal clear. The system interface, the administrative dashboard, the login credentials, and the username displayed at the top. Adrian Keller. Admin access. Victor slowly lifted his head. That's not possible, he said. Across the table, Adrian Keller forced out a nervous laugh. Yeah. Fake. Detective Laura Bennett didn't react to the denial. She simply folded her hands together calmly. The image was taken during a monitored access session 2 weeks ago, she said. The system logs recorded every action. Dylan shook his head. I don't even know how to use Adrian's stupid program. Victor turned toward his son. Did you ever access Adrian's system? Dylan looked irritated. Of course not, Elaine stepped closer to the table, her voice uneasy. There has to be some mistake. Dylan works in marketing, not it. Bennett nodded slowly. That's true. She opened the folder again, but according to our records, Adrian Keller logged into the system using a company network terminal. Dylan crossed his arms. So, Bennett continued calmly, that terminal was used to reroute encrypted data traffic during the breach. Victor felt his stomach twist. You're accusing my son now? Presenting evidence? Dylan's voice rose. This is ridiculous. But the detective wasn't finished. During that session, she continued, someone attempted to alter the security logs to make it appear that Adrian Keller had executed the breach. Victor looked at Dylan again. His expression had changed. Dylan. Dylan glared at the detective. You're twisting things. Bennett slid another document across the table. These are the system commands executed during that login. Victor scanned the lines. Network routing changes. Firewall. Bypass commands. Encrypted data transfers. And at the end of the command list, a final instruction. User _activity _override. Adrian Keller. Victor's hands tightened. Why would someone do that? Elaine whispered. Bennett answered quietly. To redirect the blame. The room felt colder. Dylan suddenly stepped forward and grabbed the papers. This doesn't prove anything, he snapped. Victor watched him carefully now. Then explain it. Dylan hesitated. For the first time that night, he didn't have an immediate answer. Elaine's voice trembled slightly. Dylan. But Dylan shook his head aggressively. This is Adrian's fault, he said. Victor frowned. What do you mean? Dylan pointed toward the evidence. He built the system, right? He had access to everything. Bennett nodded slightly. Yes. So, he could have planted all this. Victor looked uncertain now. Could he? Bennett answered without hesitation. No. Dylan's voice grew louder. How can you be so sure? The detective closed the folder slowly, because the login session was traced through 3 independent security monitors. Victor frowned. What monitors? Bennett met his eyes. Adrian's system. Dylan blinked. What? Bennett continued. CenturyShield doesn't just track external attacks. She paused. It records every internal access attempt as well. Victor slowly understood what she meant. Meaning, Bennett looked directly at Dylan. Meaning Adrian knew someone inside your company was manipulating the servers. Dylan's face tightened, and instead of confronting them immediately, Bennett glanced toward the front window, where the flashing police lights still reflected across the glass. Let the system keep recording. Victor whispered, why? Bennett answered simply, to gather enough evidence. Dylan laughed nervously again. You're saying Adrian set all this up? Bennett shook her head. No. She stepped closer to the table. He just waited for the right moment. Victor frowned. What moment? Bennett's voice lowered slightly. A moment when the person responsible tried to move the stolen data. Victor felt a chill run through him. Did that happen? Bennett nodded. Double quotes, yes. Dylan suddenly looked uneasy. Victor noticed immediately. What is it? Dylan shook his head. Nothing. But Bennett opened the folder one last time. Actually, she said calmly, it happened about 20 minutes ago. Victor stared. At her 20 minutes? Yes, Lane whispered. That's when Adrian left. Bennett nodded slowly. Exactly. Victor's eyes widened as the realization finally hit him. Adrian hadn't just walked out of the house. He had triggered something. Something planned. Something precise. Victor turned toward the detective. What happened when the data moved? Bennett's answer was quiet. The transfer was intercepted. Dylan's voice cracked slightly. Intercepted. Bennett nodded. Double quotes. Yes. Victor's voice lowered. Where did the transfer go? The detective held up one final page from the investigation file. The destination address was printed clearly. At the top, Victor's heart dropped when he read it. Because the receiving account belonged to Dylan Keller. Asterisk. Asterisk. The room went completely silent. For several seconds, no one spoke. The flashing police lights outside continued to paint the hallway walls red and blue. But inside the Keller house, time itself felt frozen. Victor Keller stared. At the page in Detective Bennett's hand, like he was trying to convince himself, he'd read it wrong, but he hadn't. The account number listed on the document was clearly registered under one name, Dylan Keller. Victor slowly looked up. Tell me that's not real. Across the hallway, Dylan stood perfectly still. His confident expression, the same one he had worn all night, was gone. In its place was something far less comfortable. Fear. That's ridiculous, Dylan said quickly. Anyone could create an account with my name. Detective Laura Bennett didn't argue. She simply handed Victor another page from the file. This is the bank verification. Victor grabbed the document and scanned it. The account had been opened 8 months earlier. Private offshore branch, verified identity, linked personal email. Victor's voice dropped. Dylan. Dylan raised his hands defensively. Dad, this is crazy. Elaine stepped forward nervously. There must be a misunderstanding. But Bennett shook her head. There isn't. Victor turned toward the detective. How much money are we talking about? Bennett answered calmly. The intercepted transfer was worth $24 million? Elaine gasped. Dylan looked like he had been punched in the chest. That's impossible. Victor's hands were shaking slightly now. 24 million? Yes. Dylan laughed nervously. That doesn't even make sense. I don't have that kind of access. Bennett replied quietly. You did? Victor looked confused. How? The detective pointed toward the evidence folder. Through the administrative access to your company's servers. Victor slowly turned toward Dylan again. You told me you never touched those systems. Dylan avoided eye contact. I didn't. Victor's voice rose. Then explain the login records. Dylan's jaw tightened. They're fake. But Bennett calmly placed another photograph on the table. This one showed something very different. Security. Camera footage. A SAMED. And a clear image of Dylan sitting at a computer terminal inside Keller Financial's server room. Victor stared at it. When was this taken? 2 weeks ago, Bennett replied. Dylan slammed his hand on the table. This proves nothing. Victor's patience finally snapped. Stop lying. The word echoed through the hallway. Elaine looked shocked. Victor had never spoken to Dylan like that before, but tonight wasn't normal anymore. Victor pointed at the photo. Why were you in the server room? Dylan didn't answer. Victor's voice grew colder. You work in marketing. You have no reason to be near those systems. Dylan's silence was suddenly louder than any argument. Elaine whispered Dylan. But the detective spoke before he could respond. There's something else you should know. Victor looked exhausted. What now? Bennett flipped to the last page of the investigation file. The financial breach wasn't the only thing Adrian discovered. Victor frowned. Do you mean? Bennett held up the document. These are the encrypted communications sent from the account connected to the stolen funds. Victor stared at the printed messages. The sender name was hidden behind coded addresses, but the recipient was labeled Clearlydk. Victor slowly raised his head. Dylan. Dylan's breathing had grown uneven now. You don't know that? Bennett ignored the protest. These messages were sent to a hacker group that specializes in corporate data theft. Elaine felt her knees weaken. No. Victor looked like the air had been knocked out of him. You hired hackers? Dylan finally exploded. It wasn't supposed to go like this. The words burst out before he could stop them. The moment they left his mouth, everyone froze. Victor whispered slowly. What did you just say? Dylan realized what he had done, but it was too late. The officers in the hallway immediately stepped forward. Detective Bennett closed the folder quietly. Thank you, she said. Dylan stared at her. For what? Bennett nodded toward the officers. For confirming the confession. Before Dylan could react, one of the officers stepped behind him. Adrian Keller. He said firmly, You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit cyber fraud and financial theft. Elaine cried out. Victor didn't move, and as the handcuffs clicked around Dylan's wrists, another police car slowly pulled into the driveway. Detective Bennett glanced toward the window. Victor noticed, Who else is coming? Bennett answered. Calmly, the person who helped us solve the case. Victor felt a strange tension in his chest. Who? But before the detective could answer, the front door opened again, and Adrian Keller walked back into the house. The moment the front door opened, every person in the Keller house turned toward it. Standing in the doorway under the flashing red and blue lights was Adrian Keller. For a second, no one spoke. The same son they had thrown out less than an hour earlier now stood calmly in front of them again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood 2 federal cybercrime agents and another officer carrying a sealed evidence case. Adrian stepped inside slowly. His expression was calm, almost unreadable. The house felt very different now, just 40 minutes earlier. Adrian had stood in the same hallway holding a small backpack, while his family laughed at him. Now the police stood between them. Detective Laura. Bennett gave Adrian a small nod. Perfect timing, Adrian nodded back. Did the transfer trigger? Bennett. Closed the investigation folder, exactly as you predicted. Across the room, Adrian Keller stood in handcuffs between 2 officers. His confident attitude had disappeared completely. You set this up? Dylan shouted. Adrian looked at him quietly. You set it up yourself. Victor finally found his voice. Adrian. Adrian turned toward him. Victor struggled to process. Everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes, you worked with the police. Adrian shrugged slightly. For a while, Elaine looked pale. But why didn't you tell us? Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the house slowly. The same house where his family had just thrown him out like a stranger? Then he said something simple. You never asked? Victor felt the words hit harder than any accusation. Dylan laughed bitterly. You think you're some kind of hero now? Adrian remained calm. No. Dylan glared at him. You ruined my life. Adrian shook his head slightly. You did that. Victor stepped closer. Adrian, I don't understand, he said. Why didn't you stop this sooner? Adrian glanced at Detective Bennett. Because evidence matters. Bennett nodded in agreement. When Adrian first contacted us 3 weeks ago, we didn't have enough proof to make an arrest. Victor frowned, so he waited. Yes, Bennett said. Dylan's voice was shaking now. You were spying on me. Adrian looked at him. No, he paused. I was protecting the company. Victor blinked. What company? Adrian gave a small, tired smile. Yours. The words confused everyone in the room. Elaine spoke softly. What do you mean? Adrian walked over to the dining table where the evidence documents were spread out. 3 months ago, he said. My system detected suspicious network traffic inside Keller Financial. Victor frowned. You never told me. Adrian looked up. Would you have listened? Victor didn't answer. Adrian continued. I thought it was an outside hacker at first, but the activity kept coming from internal login sessions. Dylan tried to interrupt. You're lying. But Adrian ignored him. So I monitored the system quietly, Bennett added, and he shared the data with us. Victor rubbed his forehead. You're saying you watched all of this happen? Adrian nodded. Yes, Elaine whispered. But why? Adrian's answer was calm. Because the moment the hackers moved the stolen money, we could trace the entire operation, Bennett gestured toward Dylan, and that's exactly what happened tonight. Dylan looked furious. You planned this? Adrian shook his head. No. He glanced toward the front door. You did. Victor finally understood something that made his chest tighten. You knew he would try to move the money tonight. Nodded. Yes. Double quotes. Victor frowned. How? Adrian gave a small smile. Because earlier tonight, he looked directly at Dylan. You panicked. Dylan's face darkened. What are you talking about? Adrian continued calmly. When Mom and Dad threw me out, you thought the person who built the security system was gone? Victor felt a chill run through him. So Dylan believed the servers were unprotected? Adrian nodded. Exactly. Ow. Dylan suddenly looked terrified. You manipulated them, he said quietly. Adrian didn't deny it. You manipulated yourself. The officers began escorting Dylan toward the door. He struggled slightly. This isn't over. Adrian watched silently, but before Dylan was taken outside, Victor spoke again. Adrian. Adrian turned. Victor's voice sounded completely different. Now, not angry, not confident, just uncertain. Why did you come back tonight? Adrian looked around the house one last time. Then he gave a quiet answer. Because there's one more thing you deserve to know. Victor frowned. What? Adrian's voice was calm. The hackers Dylan hired weren't just targeting banks. Victor's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Adrian looked directly at him. They were planning to drain Keller Financial itself. The room went silent again. Elaine whispered, What? Adrian nodded toward the police officers taking Dylan outside. He didn't just betray the law. Adrian paused. He betrayed the entire family. Asterisk, asterisk. The front door closed behind the officers as they escorted Dylan Keller outside. For a few seconds, the Keller house felt unnaturally quiet. The flashing police lights outside still filled the windows with red and blue reflections. But inside the living room, no one moved. Victor Keller stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the door. Where his son had just been taken away, his voice came out low and unsteady. Adrian, is that true? Adrian stood near the dining table, the same place where the evidence files were still spread across the surface. Yes, he said calmly. Elaine slowly sat down in one of the chairs as if her legs had suddenly lost strength. But Dylan said, The hackers were stealing from banks, she whispered. Detective Laura Bennett answered before Adrian could. That was only part of the plan. Victor turned toward her. What was the other part? Bennett opened the investigation folder again. The hackers were preparing a second transfer. Victor felt a knot tighten in his chest. How much? The detective glanced at the final. Report everything. Victor blinked. Everything. Adrian nodded. They had already mapped your company's entire financial system. Elaine covered her mouth. My God. Adrian continued quietly. Once the bank transfers succeeded, they were going to empty Keller Financial's internal accounts and disappear. Victor looked stunned. You're telling me Dylan was about to destroy the company? Adrian didn't soften the truth. Yes. Victor slowly sat down in the chair across from his wife. For the first time in years, the powerful businessman who had always controlled every situation looked completely defeated. I don't understand. That, he said quietly. Adrian looked at him. What part? Victor rubbed his forehead. Why would Dylan do something like this? Adrian's voice remained calm, because he thought he could get away with it. Elaine shook her head weakly, but he had everything. Adrian looked around the house. Again, the expensive furniture, the marble floors, the luxury decorations that had always defined success for his family. He wanted more. Victor let out a long breath. And you stopped him. Adrian shrugged slightly. I stopped the hackers. Detective Bennett closed the folder. And without Adrian's system, we would never have traced the network. Victor looked up slowly. So the company, it's safe? Adrian nodded. Double quotes. Yes. Victor sat silently for several seconds, then he looked at Adrian with an expression that had never appeared on his face before. Regret. We threw you out tonight, he said quietly. Adrian didn't respond. Victor swallowed. And the entire time, you were protecting us. Coney finally spoke. I wasn't protecting you. Victor frowned. What do you mean? Coney looked toward the evidence files on the table. I was protecting what I built. Elaine looked confused. Your cybersecurity? System, Adrian nodded. Send TrueShield. Victor suddenly remembered the article Detective Bennett had shown them earlier, the AI defense platform. Yes, Victor leaned forward slightly, and the police used it for this investigation. Bennett nodded. It's one of the most advanced systems we've ever seen. Victor looked back at Adrian. So your little computer project? Adrian gave a small smile. Works! Elaine stared at him. Adrian, why didn't you tell us? Adrian answered quietly. Would it have mattered? Neither of his parents spoke. The silence itself was the answer. After a moment, Detective Bennett stepped toward the door. Our work here is finished. Victor stood slowly. Detective. Thank you. Bennett shook her head. You should thank your son. She glanced at Adrian. He's the reason this case didn't turn into the largest cyber theft in state history. Then the officers left. The house fell quiet again. Only 3 people remained in the hallway. Victor looked at Adrian with a mixture of pride, regret, and disbelief. Adrian, about what happened earlier tonight. Adrian picked up his backpack. From the floor, you don't have to apologize. Victor looked surprised. I don't. Adrian shook his head. No. He walked toward the front door. Elaine stood up quickly. Where are you going? Adrian opened the door. Home. Victor frowned. This is your home. Adrian paused. Then he said something that finally made Victor understand what had truly changed. No. Adrian stepped outside. This was... The door closed behind him, and for the first time that night, the Keller house felt empty.